Well,
Hmm?
Solomon.
I honestly don't know. Oh, here we go. Welcome, folks. We're gonna get started. And we may have stragglers. The weather is good. I did a reading last night in Syracuse. And I think we had 10 people, right or center. So, yeah. Plenty of people going out. However, they can come. Because they're missing something really good. This is Jennifer Sears. Jennifer Sears. Her leadership. Husband Massimo. Jennifer grew up in Elkhart, Indiana, where her father served as minister at Southside Fellowship on the campus of the Mennonite Seminary. Her father was from the Amish Mennonite communities of central Illinois. Her mother's family includes descendants of survivors of the Hofstetler Massacre in Hamburg, Pennsylvania, who migrated to the Mennonite enclaves around Holmes County, Ohio. So I can say anything else about I don't think about your writing, though.
Oh, I have,
I don't know
is
why.
there anything going to
No, got cut off. Oh no, there she is. This is the worst bio I've ever done. I'm so sorry. Jennifer Sears' stories and essays have been published in many literary journals and have received citations in Best American Essays, Best American Short Stories, and Best American Non-Required Reading. Her writing has been recognized by fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts, the New York Foundation for the Arts, and the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the 2024 Book Award from the Northeast Modern Language Association. She is Associate Professor of English at our beloved New York City College of Technology and CUNY. Jennifer, everybody.
Thank you. So the bio, the Mennonite bio is partly because this reading is titled Writing a Mennonite Life. So I chose two things to read tonight that reflect that history. And does anybody know anything about Mennonites? Anybody Mennonite here? A little bit?
Yeah.
Okay. So my family is from central Illinois and also from Ohio in the Mennonite areas there. My mother came by way of Pennsylvania. And my last name Sears actually is the Americanized version of Zeher, Z-E-H-R, which is a very Amish name, if you're familiar with those names. And the first thing I'm gonna read from is part of a historical project that I did last summer, and it's based on my dad's experience. He grew up in central Illinois on a small farm, and one time late in his life, he was talking about his childhood, and he talked a lot about his childhood in his sermons, and but he suddenly remembered that they had POWs working in the field right beside his one-room school. And I was fascinated by this. And he was very sensitive, and he said that they used to jump over the fence and they used to talk to these guys. And when he was telling me, he said that they eventually, one of the soldiers actually said, one of the German prisoners actually said, you really shouldn't come out here. You know, we're worried something will happen to you. And but what really hung with them was that he said, you know, at that time, even though certainly they were, you know, from the German military, they were probably being bombed and they didn't know what happened to their families. And just the weight of that history and his not knowing that really resonated with him. And and also the other part of that story that intrigued me was that in his neighborhood, in the farm, you know, area where they lived, all of the neighbors were together. And some of them were Mennonites, some of them were not. And Mennonites are pacifist. And so in World War II, that was the first time they could be conscientious objectors. And there was a lot of tension between people in the town whose sons were going into the military and sometimes getting killed. And the pacifists who were working and doing work service, but were not going to the military. So that tension was very thick in the town, and that added to this tension of having these German prisoners there as well. So that story really intrigued me, and so I went and did some research. And I found this great historian from Washington, and these are pictures actually of the prisoners, and there they are in the field. And I'm just gonna maybe this over here. Oops, I wasn't good.
Hang on.
And this is my dad's, this is his whole entire class, his whole entire school is in this truck. And so this would have been about the age when that's this happening in the story. And one thing that he told me, and that I did some research on, the teachers at that time, they had such a hard time finding women to actually stay to be teachers, that they would have a new teacher every year. And I met one woman who was in 7th grade, and she was asked to go to the one-room school and be a teacher at that time because there was just such a shortage of teachers. So this young woman is very young. And these are just some of the ads from the work shortage, which is how they explained to the people why there were these Germans there. And at the same time, it was really difficult finding any information because they didn't report it in the papers, partly for security reasons and because there was a lot of anger at the way that the prisoners actually were treated according to Geneva Conventions. And some people thought they were treated too well. And so those tensions were part of why they kept it so quiet, where these camps actually were. And then there was a large camp outside of Washington called Camp Ellis. And all of you can't really find those sites anymore unless you know they were there. So this is one of the Libby's canning factory where they worked when they weren't in the fields. And here are 2 of the prisoners who actually came back after they went back to Germany, and they came back and visited the town. Some of them tried to become citizens here in the US, partly because of that they were treated so well. And here they are also in the fields. And so they would interact a little bit with people, and they also there would be a guard who would be watching them, but it was very casual. They weren't heavily surveilled, and mostly because there was nowhere for them to go, I think. So my dad said that they rarely saw any soldiers guarding them. And then in the camps, these pictures really stunned me. In the camps, these are the German soldiers, and they were staging theater productions in the camps. They would get costumes, materials sent to them. They would make their own costumes. And then there was a local photographer who took some of these pictures for them. And that's, I think, where the historian got the actual photographs, was from those photographs taken by the local photographer. But the next one in particular, it just has that Weimar sort of area or era. And so here they're doing, I think, Arabian Nights or 1001 Nights. And so the story just intrigued me the more I found out about it.
And those are German soldiers.
Those are the German, yeah, prisoners. Those are the POWs. And they're in drag, they're more. And it's just not the image that we have of these guys. So the interaction between the local people and again, there was a lot of tension. These pictures don't really show that. But there was a lot of tension. And so this picture I liked because it's the soldier and 2 of the kids are with the soldier. And this would have been about the age of my dad and his friends. And then this is my dad's house. So this is just getting into the story that I'm working on. this is what it looks at that time. And it was right across the street from the school and right across the street from the field where the men would have been working. And it's still there at the house.
Was he Mennonite at that time?
Yes, his family, they were very Mennonite, historically Mennonite. Both of my parents' families came, my mother's family came in the 1700s, and my dad's family came up in Mississippi in the early 1800s. And they came, they were German-speaking Swiss, and they all were from not Zurich, but an area sort of near Zurich. And so they remained Mennonites for all of those generations. They were Amish when they immigrated here, and then some of the Amish became looser, like in terms of the clothing, and they became Mennonites. The Amish in Europe, they're actually an outbreak of the Mennonites. So that relationship between Mennonites and Amish has always been there. And the pacifism is something that has always been historically part of that tradition. And as early as the 16th century, and that's why they actually weren't Protestant. They were the third way, they were Anabaptists, so they didn't baptize as children. And they didn't recognize the flag for the government that was newly forming in the sort of the German and Swiss states. So it was part of the Reformation, but they were not Protestant. So and my parents' family, both of my parents, their families came from the same small area. So even though they were here and 7 generations, they all came out of this one sort of very cloistered kind of area in Switzerland. So I'm going to read just a short passage from the novel that's in progress.
Jennifer, before you do, is there a beeping noise coming from something that's not your computer? Is that something, is that our fault?
I don't know. Is it?
That one,
That beeping
I
noise?
don't know where it comes from, but
Okay, I just don't want you to have to contend with that, you know?
Yeah.
I can imagine what it is.
I don't think my phone is on.
Is it over?
Mr. Dickey.
Yeah, that's.
So this is called Other People's Sons, and it's, the title is, of the overall novel is, partly thinking of in the neighborhood, all these young boys growing up together and working together on the farm, and some of them having to leave to war, and the Mennonites who did not. And sometimes the Mennonites would work in the farms of the boys who had left. And then also because of my dad's memory of, or his sort of regret about not realizing that the German soldiers or the German prisoners also had children at home. So, all right. The darkness hovering over Metamora had moved its way toward them, pellets of icy rain striking the roof in the early afternoon. Though the day's lessons were almost complete, Miss Wolf told Darcy to add coal to the stove. They'd have to wait, she said, until it was safe for the youngest children to make their way home. But when Darcy stood, he saw the Germans hovering on the other side of the fence. Prisoners, he said. Miss Wolf said that Darcy called these men in, but Darcy wouldn't. Miss Wolf said, weren't they called on to be generous to strangers? Though she had avoided religion, Miss Wolf quoted a verse from the Bible. Be not forgetful to entertain strangers, she said, for thereby some have entertained angels unaware. Those men aren't angels, Jack said. Samuel didn't like how the boys spoke to Miss Wolf. As everyone watched, he put on his coat. Outside, the sleet and rain stung his face. Sirs, he shouted. He didn't know what to call them. Soldiers or prisoners who'd been soldiers. But the Germans huddled with their backs toward him, didn't hear. Sirs, he shouted again. Reinhard climbed the fence first. Eager for shelter, the Germans all followed Samuel inside, their work boots tracking mud and pieces of dried vines, as Miss Wolf directed them to the benches at the back of the room. The men looked enormous. Their wet shirts and coats hung from their shoulders. They carried in the smell of sweat and cigarettes and rain. The children pressed their backs to the walls. Samuel, standing next to the stove, saw at once the schoolroom as the Germans might see it. Regulation maps and American flag, the old Victrola, a photograph of Miss Wolfe's beloved William James. The war bonds poster Mrs. Steiner had hung in September without consulting the other mothers, and about which his mother had words. With dread, Samuel imagined the men lifting the lids of their desks and finding the paper cutouts from the backs of cereal boxes, Hitlers and Tojos and Mussolinis, tanks with worn edges and creased Air Force planes. Even the Mennonite boys traded the figures like baseball cards. 3 Tojos for 1 Hitler, 2 lumbering tanks for a plane. Thank you, miss, for taking us in, Reinhardt said. He said their guard, Tom Martins, and one of their own had taken the tractor back to the Steiners before the ground got too soft. He was certain it wouldn't be too long before a truck came for all of them. Never mind, Miss Wolf said. She pushed her hand through her hair, a nervous tic her students knew well, and said the children, Samuel heard her call them, had been practicing Latin recitations all morning, rehearsing early for the Christmas program. The children, she said, could use an audience. Samuel hated Latin. He didn't want the men to see him as one of the children. And he wanted Miss Wolf to stop moving that way in front of them, because in the midst of her moving and reorganizing the day, her fingers moving again to her face, her hair had come loose. Pieces of her hair fell down her back. He noticed even her face changed before them. Though they were shivering with cold and maybe a little afraid, the Germans held their bodies with more ease than the fathers and men he knew. They held themselves like trained men. Men used to being surrounded by people. They moved like men from cities. They were more comfortable. He saw Miss Wolf notice them too. Samuel was relieved when the younger children stepped forward, and Miss Wolf asked the men which recitations they wanted to hear. But the men didn't understand. Then Miss Wolf spoke to them in her father's German. The language inside the classroom made Jack Maxwell squeeze his eyes shut. There was silence. Then the Germans spoke in a rush. The men looked away from men waiting for months to be understood. Reinhardt interrupted with what must have been a joke because his men and Miss Wolf too started laughing. The children stayed silent, watching until one of the prisoners stood and walked to the front. We found something, Reinhardt said, switching to English, so they all would understand. The man put a large stone on the desk. An arrowhead, Miss Wolf said. An axe head, Jack Maxwell corrected her as he slid toward the door. Samuel guessed the men had been working near the spring on the outer edge of the Steiner's land, where a tangle of prairie grass and sumac bushes surrounded a spring. He too had found flints and Indian pieces there. They'd found the stone that morning, Reinhold explained. There was something respectful in it. It was something to keep. But they couldn't take it back to the camp. Because it's a weapon, Miss Wolf, Jack Maxwell said. Miss Wolf said, we'll keep it. A reminder. Of what? Jack Maxwell said. Miss Wolf took the stone. As they all watched, she opened the desk drawer, and as she did, the door of the schoolhouse slammed loudly, jolting the prisoners to attention. One man shouted, another dropped to the floor. That was Jack Maxwell, Miss Wolf said calmly. He's run off. And one of the Germans laughed, except for the soldier who still shivered on the floor. They all started laughing, as if relieved to have remembered themselves standing there in an Illinois schoolhouse with a young woman who understood them and wasn't afraid. Maybe they could even feel she wanted to be somewhere else. That girl is lonely, Samuel's mother had said. But the men were getting too close. Samuel stepped forward, afraid for her, even though she was laughing, ignoring the children with her hair half undone, which was all Tom Martin saw as he rushed in. Tom Martin's was the guard, I should say. I see this young lady is entertaining you fine, he said. Miss Wolf stepped back as if he'd slapped her. Then Tom Martin shouted at the prisoners, who shoved their arms into their wet coats and filed for the door, except for Reinhardt, who wasn't afraid of Tom. As the others filed into the rain, he smiled. He pointed toward Samuel, who stood next to Miss Wolf, and said, "That boy's in love." Miss Wolf laughed. Samuel felt his face go red. That horror even might have been all he remembered, that boy's in love. The words layered over the rhythm of boots on the wooden floor and sleet striking the roof. But because the children are asked so many times to repeat the story and to remember everything, he remembered how strange the maps and pictures on the walls had appeared, how the paper cutouts inside the desk felt like dangerous things, and how Miss Wolf's hair had come undone. And it's because his memory seemed so certain, it seemed a betrayal when another kid's story contradicted his own. Because Samuel remembered how the pumpkins glistened outside in the rain, and how the Germans who put the stone on Miss Wolf's desk had 2 fingers missing. Only he remembered Miss Wolf had quoted the Bible, Hebrews 13:2, unaware, she'd said. But most people listened most to Jack Maxwell's story, maybe because he was the oldest, maybe because he'd almost caught his death from the cold after he'd run into the storm. She called them angels, Jack told them. He said, you could see it coming even then. She called them inside. She let them in.
And I think I can pull this projector, if that's because I suspect this is the source of it.
That's
I
it.
hope.
Maybe.
We'll find out.
Well,
It could be that.
So in that story, Miss Wolf, the teacher, her father was actually, he was German, her mother was Mennonite and had gone over to Germany after World War I as part of as a nurse, as part of the rebuilding work that was going on in Germany. And then he came back with his wife and with Ursula Wolf and or Ursula's mother. And so there was already suspicion about them because her father was German, and she didn't want to be a teacher. She had sort of been forced into that role. So that's part of a larger novel. And, Samuel does end up becoming friends with one of the German soldiers, and his older brother, who is a conscientious objector, ends up leaving and joining the military, despite the family's beliefs. So, and that takes place in 1944. The second piece that I'm going to read, I still have
yeah.
a little time.
Right.
Okay. So this one, the second story I'm going to read is called What Mennonite Girls Are Good For. And this takes place in Kansas, which where I did live for a short time. It's where I went to. There's a Mennonite college there, and it's where I went to college in Newton, Kansas. It's also a Mennonite enclave there. And my father in Indiana and also in Kansas, as part of his work with the church, he was part of what was called the sanctuary movement in the 80s and the very early 90s. And they were helping immigrants from Central America at that time flee from the regimes, the US backed regimes there, through the United States into Canada. And it was with other pacifist churches. And it was actually quite well known at the time, although similarly to the research I was doing about the German POWs, it was very hard to find information about the sanctuary movement. And just recently, there is a New Yorker writer, Jonathan, what's his name? I can't think of his last name, but he just published a book about immigration, and he wrote more about the sanctuary movement than I've seen anywhere else. So it is being written about a little bit now. And so this story is called What Mennonite Girls Are Good For. I'm just going to start reading it. I might break off because it's a little long. So, all right, What Mennonite Girls Are Good For. And this young girl is a minister's daughter. She's just graduated from high school and is taking night classes at the Mennonite college there. What Mennonite girls are good for. Mañana, Raul said. Tomorrow, Ruthie said. She could practically smell Tecate through the phone line. I wait for you, she heard, as she shoved the receiver into its wall mount and returned to the living room, where her roommate Bev sprawled in front of the television. Refugee, Bev asked again. Don't know why you put up with that. He's lonely, Ruthie said. Get one of the Spanish boys at the restaurant to tell you how to say fuck off, Bev said. That's what I'd do. Weak, Bev meant, and Ruthie understood. But even if she had known those words in Spanish, she wouldn't have used them. Bev raised the volume on the television. Ruthie sat down. She didn't know what to do about Raul. He was different, more sensitive than the others had been. And he always called twice, the second time drunker than the first, as if he'd sat in that barren church apartment agonizing over what he meant to say, instead of realizing she'd hardly been listening at all. Until that morning, Ruthie had been looking forward to the 2-hour drive west to Ellsworth County, where she planned to take pictures of the petroglyphs on Inscription Rock for a Kansas State history course she was taking at the Mennonite College. She'd only taken the summer class to placate her parents, whose determined optimism about her future always made her feel worse about the fact that all she'd been doing in the 2 years since they'd moved there was wait tables at Hank's, not even the best truck stop in their town. When she stopped at her parents' house to ask if she could borrow their truck to better manage Ellsworth's off-road terrain, Raul had been standing there, his face still sweating from whatever day job the church had found for him. You should take Raul along, her father said. Raul nodded, though Ruthie didn't know for certain if he'd understood. Her father knew nothing about Raul's late night calls. Raul wasn't even certain how much of them Raul remembered. Ruthie's father was a minister at one of the local Mennonite churches participating in the Overground Railroad, a church-based action group that gave emergency transport to men fleeing state and guerrilla armies in Guatemala and El Salvador, men with enough violence in their lives to be given church-sponsored asylum in Canada. By the time the men, she learned early not to call them by that faceless sweep of a word, refugees, got to their nowhere town. They'd already endured some harrowing escape through Mexico and over the US border, only to find themselves stalled in Newton, waiting for documentation to continue north. Her father found the men housing and odd jobs, and more than once gave the single men Ruthie's number if they asked for it after meeting her. She never told him they called at night, sometimes drunk. The town's dull nights leaving empty hours for memories of their recent traumas to erupt. Stories tumbled into her ear. Towns massacred. A child's naked body abandoned beside the road. A colony of monkeys senselessly shot dead in a jungle clearing. So sorry, Ruthie would respond. Or can't imagine. She knew they called her because she was one of the few people they met even close to their own age. And she was the minister's daughter. They trusted her. Don't tell your father was how Raul ended their few conversations. Ruthie was never certain if he meant his late night calls or his drinking, but this didn't matter. For whatever reason, respect, she supposed. She never told her father about any of those calls. The next day, Ruthie picked up her father's truck and drove down Main Street to the apartment, a church-donated unit, where most of the men ended up. She passed the railroad station and stopped in front of the road to dilapidated buildings just south of the tracks. After she rang the doorbell, she returned to the air-conditioned truck cab to wait. Through the windshield, the day seemed bored even with itself. A man spit chewed tobacco into a beer bottle as he leaned against the wall of the Legal Tender Saloon, the lone holdout from Newton's past as a rowdy 19th century cowtown, situated on the southernmost curve of the Santa Fe Railroad. Now, 100 years on, late-night drinkers staggering out of the Legal Tender squared off, only with sober, fresh-faced workers arriving for early morning shifts at the popular Mennonite bakery across the street, a nightly showdown between the two halves of the town. Finally, Raoul emerged. Ruthie could see he thought it was a date. He'd slicked back his hair with gel and put on a t-shirt so fresh from its packaging. A grid of creases showed across his chest. He wore oversized dress pants and large, shiny shoes. Cast-offs, Ruthie guessed, donated by a well-meaning church member. He didn't get they would be driving through dusty fields, squinting at rocks. The worst part, though, was that he thought it was a date. Raoul opened the door. Ruthie, he said. The solemn expression the men on the Overground Railroad wore always made Ruthie realize how much people smiled in their town, regardless of their genuine feelings. She decided she'd return the greeting his way. Raoul, she said grimly. Raoul looked startled. Ruthie liked how not smiling felt. Get in, Raoul, she said. At the gas station, Raoul leapt out and went for the nozzle, his eagerness to do what little he could, only exaggerating his vulnerability. This irritated Ruthie, as did her instinct to make him feel better. You don't have to do that, Raoul, she would have said before that day, or, smiling, thank you, Raoul, so kind. Instead, she stepped out of the truck without even looking at him. As she walked toward the cashier's station, she saw Peggy, another waitress from Hank's, at a pump. This too would have irritated Ruthie, except that if anyone had to see her with Raoul, it might as well be Peggy. When Ruthie was close enough to hear, Peggy gestured with her chin. What's that? Nice way of asking, Ruth said. So, tell me. My father's friend. Don't see Daddy. Ruthie shrugged. Though her father never asked her to keep his activities quiet, the Overground Railroad wasn't the kind of thing she told non-Mennonites like her roommate Bev or Peggy, and certainly not the traditionally minded customers and drivers who ate at Hank's. Peggy yanked the nozzle out of the truck. What do you think he tastes like, hot sauce? Tecate, more like it. Peggy laughed, surprised by Ruthie's sting. You're so nice, Peggy often teased during their work shifts, mocking Ruthie's soft voice and gentle presence. You have a good time now, Peggy said, opening her car door. Sealed inside of the roar of the air conditioner, Peggy's 13-year-old son waved. Her husband, newly returned from military service in Kuwait, sick, silent, addicted to computer games, and impotent as all at Hank's knew, stared dully through the front window. Peggy honked as she drove off, taunting Ruthie with a thumbs up. Ruthie looked back. Raoul had returned the nozzle to the tank and was washing the front windows, taking care not to ruin his new clothes. Weak, nice, doing God's work. That's what Mennonite girls were good for. Ruthie went into the station to pay. I think I'll stop there. Yeah. Go on.
How close are you? Yeah.
I'll read a few more pages. Okay. They headed straight toward Hutchinson on US 50. To the south, parched yellow wheat fields unfurled toward the Oklahoma Panhandle, interrupted only by crops of fiercely green milo. To the north, there was only the same. An awkward silence dominated the truck cab. Ruthie could feel Raoul waiting for her to carry the conversation as she did on the phone. But she wasn't going to do that anymore. She shoved her sunglasses onto her face. The glasses were ridiculous, movie star big, but good at deflecting prairie sun. And they made her feel sophisticated, despite her t-shirt and shorts. Ruthie raised her chin. Raoul turned toward the window beside him. He cleared his throat uncomfortably. He was attractive, small-boned with fine facial features and elegant nose. Raoul was only 3 years older than her. but his eyes had a steady gaze behind them built on adaptation to lightness, his body defined by the necessity of moving on. She remembered the faith story Raoul gave at church just after he arrived. A Mennonite girl Ruthie's age, who was already making herself useful, serving Mayan communities outside of Chichicastenango, had provided translation. Raoul had been a school teacher accused by both guerrilla and governmental forces of using his position to incite rebellion. Other teachers had already been disappeared. Only weeks before that church presentation, Raoul arrived to his schoolroom and found it emptied, a blood-stained knife stabbed into his wooden desk. He fled the building, fled his town, and didn't stop until he reached Guat City. He didn't know if any of his students, children, he emphasized, had been killed on his account. He didn't know if the screams and gunshots he heard in dreams were memories or imaginings made of his own worst fears. Raoul ended his story abruptly. As the translator caught up, Raoul stared at the back of the sanctuary so intensely, Ruthie turned, half expecting to see parts of his story too painful to share imprinted on the bare white wall. In the truck, Ruthie turned on the radio. Only one station played on that stretch of the highway. The twang of country music guitars filled the truck cab. This music, Raoul said. I like it very much. Ruthie switched off the sound. That's funny, she said. I don't. The storage compartment between their seats was filled with cassette tapes her parents bought during the big radio fund drives, vintage seasons of Prairie Home Companion, and the very best of Fibber McGee and Molly. But those shows had the old-timey jokes her father loved, and things forever falling out of closets, jokes impossible to explain. The loud sound effects might even scare him. Gunshots, she remembered from his story. Children. She didn't want Raoul to turn into a basket case while it was just the two of them. The road thudded beneath their wheels. Raoul gripped his loose pants and stared at the fields. Resentfully, Ruthie launched into a story about the last time she'd been on that road to Hutchinson. She'd taken a bus ride home from Chicago to Wichita. The trip shouldn't have involved Hutchinson at all. But when the bus passed through Leavenworth, a man aborted carrying only a small paper bag. Instead of sitting in one of the empty rows like any normal person would have done, the man chose the seat next to hers. Ruthie glanced at Raoul. Leavenworth? Federal prison. Jail, that means. He nodded. He didn't get it. You see, Raoul, she said, I have one of those faces, nicer than I actually am. He nodded again, deciding she wouldn't care if he got her story or not, that she would tell it to the end unless he figured out how to make her stop. Ruthie detailed how the man grabbed her box of Fireball candies and poured the whole contents into his mouth, and ranted about the dumbass bus, the dumbass passengers, and the dumbass sunset hanging over the dumbass Flint Hills. The guy was kind of off, she said. You know, local. Raoul smiled. He thought perhaps she was telling a joke. Ruthie looked back at the road. Route 50 was heavily trucked by line haulers running toward the Rockies. In the afternoon glare, she had to watch for real potholes amid the false, shimmering mirages of potholes. If she had to choose a symbol for her own dumbass life, that would be the image that might explain everything. I'll stop telling the story, she said. It's stupid, really. I like it, Raoul said. This made Ruthie feel worse. But ahead there was nothing but highway, and inside the truck there was nothing but story. So she continued. At the Wichita bus station, the man from Leavenworth followed her off the bus. Assuming whoever picked her up would be equally nice, he pounced on her father and asked for a ride to Hutchinson. Her father agreed, of course. In prison in the back seat, Ruthie was subjected again to the man's rant, which improved before his male audience. He started with heroics. He'd been a dog handler in Vietnam, but after learning her father was a Mennonite minister and remembering from whatever history he had that Mennonite implied a pacifist faith, the man changed his story to one that showed how his military service led him to a peacefully minded take. After his watching his dogs go to death for each other, watching his dogs drag dying soldiers for miles back to camp. He decided love was the soul's organic state. To hate, to kill another soul, these acts the body had to be taught. These acts the body could not forget. But when US forces pulled out, there were too many dogs to take home. Jungle disease, the soldiers were told, eaten by Vietnamese. But the men who owed their lives to those dogs knew the truth. Tell me, sir, what good is it learning to love if all we do is just get put down at the end? Abruptly, Ruthie stopped telling her story. It was insensitive. It involved a war and a lonely man on the run. But it was a story born from the rhythm of that very road, born of her father's kindness, his rigorous practice of love, the same centripetal force that had drawn both of them there. And Raoul hadn't told her to stop, so she skipped to the end. On the edge of Hutch, the man directed them to a sprawling ranch house, dark except for a security light beaming from the top floor. The man got out of the car and started toward the front door as if he was expected there. Then he stopped. Beneath the glow of that lonely light, Ruthie saw his body stiffen. He knew they watched. He knew they could see no one waited for him. He'd underestimated her father's kindness, her father's infallible hope, his need to see that a door would open to welcome that man into some kind of light. Instead, the man's fierce humiliation, his lonely lie, pinned them all there until he leapt over a hedge into the prairie dark. Ruthie stopped. Raoul sat up, recognizing she'd ended her story. Your father, he said, big soul. Yes, Ruthie nodded. This was true, big soul. Her story had certainly been insensitive, but maybe this didn't matter. Raoul would hear what he needed to hear. He couldn't afford any, and otherwise, he'd put all of his trust, his very life, into the church's hands. The enormity of this terrified her. It was dishonest, even. Raoul would think he could trust white people. He'd been forced to trust them. His apartment and church-sponsored jobs kept him from the cruel words she heard waiting tables at Hank's. Or perhaps Raoul had heard those things. Perhaps Raoul had heard hatreds far worse than she ever had to hear. Tell me, Raoul, Ruthie said, do you believe in God? He turned sharply. The hell you've been through? I wouldn't blame you for lying. You have to say you believe in God to get the church's support, to get here, to stay alive, I mean. Raoul's mouth tensed. Maybe he mistook her questioning for some sort of test, some great white test of faith, or for yet another interrogation. It's okay if you don't, Ruthie said. I'm not so sure I believe in God myself. He stared at the dashboard. Forget it, Ruthie said. He probably believed anyway. You now, a story. A story. Una cuenta, she demanded. Let him do the work. Let him carry the conversation. A story, he said. He braced his hands on his thighs again. I had a wife. I had a child. Ruthie gripped the steering wheel. The road before them had not changed. The dying wheat fields, those had not changed. The dust-yellowed horizon, that too hadn't changed. I had a wife. I had a child. That was Raoul's story. Much better told. Donde vamos? Raoul demanded, as if telling his story had ripped something from him. Driving farther from the only town he knew, away from that apartment and routine jobs. It must have seemed they were driving toward the kind of place where anything might happen. I have to take pictures of petroglyphs, she said. Drawings on walls, made by native people. She added uncomfortably, Los Indios. He didn't get it. She didn't blame him. The trip was strange, as was the country's romantic fascination, with cataloging its own history of genocide. A ravine hidden by a cluster of trees took her by surprise. They descended too fast. Deep and very real potholes broke up the asphalt. The gears ground. The truck jerked. Ruthie shoved down on the clutch, but reached too late for the stick shift. On each side, the trees flattened into a green blur. as the bottom widened like a mouth below them. Raoul gasped, his knees slid forward. Ruthie felt a cold, satisfactory calm. Though she wasn't always good at it, she liked driving standard transmission. It was physical. Her hand gripping and yanking the stick shift, her bare thighs tense as her foot pressed the clutch, as her whole body tuned into the engine's hum. Driving, her whole body listened. Her body even corrected its own mistakes, if she didn't think too much. They shot out of the ravine as abruptly as they dropped into it, the road's flat expanse spilling ahead, as if the incident never happened. Raoul's thigh remained pressed against her fingers on the stick shift. She only noticed this when he took a breath, as if he'd rehearsed all night for that ridiculous moment he announced. I like you very much. You were very nice. Nice. Before that afternoon, she might have smiled. Thank you, Raoul, she might have said, or even, I like you too, on account of the hell he'd been through. But she wasn't going to do that anymore. In the awkward silence he had created, Ruthie acted as if he'd said nothing. He could believe in God. He could bear his soul all he liked. She kept his late night calls a secret. She obeyed her father and brought him along. Chin high, she had done enough. Raoul sat back. Ruthie felt a strange alertness. She felt alive. Was this what people got from being cruel? The roar of a train engine blasted Ruthie from her trance. She shoved on the brake. The truck jolted to a stop. Raoul slammed his hands on the dash, but made no sound. She'd shamed him with her silence. She'd made him feel invisible, but she would not apologize. The engine blurred past, followed by a rush of freight cars, each one yanking the next. No cross gates fell across that unpopulated stretch of highway, but she should have seen the train crossing the wide plain. I am going to stop there, so.
Thank you. I'm gonna debug the place while we're talking. Notes. Yeah, questions for Jennifer, comments, questions?
So I have a question.
Yeah.
I'm actually working on a book about donut valleys during World War II, because, being canceled, home of the Red Cross. What is your main source? Do you use like primary sources like journal entries, or how do you find the material?
For the World War II story, I went to Washington, and newspapers, very local newspapers on microfiche usually,
Okay.
have given me a lot of ideas and just gaining a sense of how people talk. And even the ads, which is why I like the microfiche and not just digital, to see like the visuals, the movie ads, the ads for rations. I mean, that has proved really helpful. And then I also went to the churches and got the church bulletins from that time, which a lot of small town churches, they keep pretty detailed bulletins about the members and just what people are going through and the conversations and concerns. So those sources of information, I think for fiction writing specifically, really helped. And it was the kind of stuff that you don't find in books. And then that source, the local historian in Washington also really helped. And then also just talking to people, interviewing people who, I need to interview as soon as I can because they're dying off.
Yeah.
Those have proved the best. Are you working on fiction or?
Fiction.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And somebody actually, there was a writer that I talked to, and she was the one who said, she said, researching that time isn't where you will get the information that you need. She said, you need to read what people were reading and watch what people at that time were watching. So I looked up the lists of novels. And the movies, I think also were really important. Because people like now are watching things more than reading.
Yeah.
So I think that's where I got a lot of the information. And also just family stories. I talked to my aunts and uncles about the same time. But and it's really fun to do that research too.
Well,
Like librarians just love researchers, and they will come up with things that you just would never find doing searches. Especially small libraries.
It's so funny because the idea just kind of fell in my lap. I originally had the idea of doing letters back and forth with a soldier and someone back home.
Yeah,
And the idea just kind of kept evolving. And I thought, well, I'll just separate the two. And then as I was learning about donut dollies, the Club Mobile service, it was actually really fascinating that we're home of the Red Cross, the
Right.
original. So it was kind of easy to get the information. But yeah, they followed the troops and were home front and are
yeah,
bringing home to them. And then I was surprised 86 of them actually died during World War II,
wow,
because they were so close to the front lines.
yeah,
So I thought, why not incorporate that in?
yeah. And archives are just troves of information, and the small town newspapers in Washington, they were publishing letters from soldiers written to, the families would take them to the newspaper office, and they would publish, so that's why those very small town newspapers really gave me more information than almost anything I had found. And at the time, my dad was still alive. And he was also just fascinated going through the microfiche for his own projects.
Okay.
And so yeah, the small town newspapers, I think, are a good place. Okay,
So thank you so much.
yeah.
Jennifer, could I follow up on one thing you said about the value of visual sources for a
Mhm.
fiction writer?
Yeah.
Because I agree with that. And I didn't expect that when I started researching for fiction. And it really is like a picture's worth 1,000 words, but it kind of is.
Yeah.
Could you talk about why it's so valuable to you to have the visual sources?
Well, for me, the visual sources from that time, so it didn't, like the ones from Washington obviously were important, but also watching movies that people were watching from the time, which are also fun to watch. For me, and reading the newspapers, because I was studying pacifists, I mean, my family is pacifist, it really began to come clear to me what that meant, because the whole media around them was all about the war. The newspapers, the movies. So if you were a pacifist, you were really going against all of the messages. I mean, women were wearing the clothing colors that's what military green and navy blue and everything, and cereal boxes and advertisements. And so for me, those visuals really made it clear what they were facing. In addition to that, the movies and listening to radio, you hear how people actually spoke, because it was a different way of using English, even though it was in the United States. You hear how people spoke, and that was really striking to me. I also listened to the radio broadcast when Roosevelt actually declared war. And there was one woman who, I think from the Senate, who said no. And you can hear her voice, you can hear her saying no, and people just booing, like it's, so to hear those things actually happening, both very locally and I think nationally, it gives you the feeling, the intensity of the time in a way. And the other thing that I began to realize by looking at the ads, so because I'm writing about a very rural area, they were moving from tractor farming, or from horse farming to tractor farming at that time. And that a little bit earlier than that, but the tractor farm companies had all been converted into military industry. So that change was really impacting the area as well. And the women, not having women to teach. So most of that became clear to me reading the newspapers, and then the visuals, because I was looking at the ads. So I don't know. And also just seeing what people were wearing. I I think is important. Seeing the women's hair. Realizing that women were cutting their hair and donating their hair. All of these things you can read about. But when you actually see the ads for those things, I think it's striking. Yeah,
It's funny you say that, because one of the things I've done was I found the audio clip of it was an unknown broadcaster during Pearl Harbor, when he was the first initial reporter.
Wow.
And they had the audio clip of him, and nobody to this day knows who he was. So
right,
it kind of adds to the mystery of it.
wow,
Mhm.
yeah. And those sound clips are, I mean,
So the ways that people talk, I was talking about this last night,
yeah,
novels anymore, which, it's not just period, it's the period and the place. It's the combination of period and place, so 1944 in Kansas,
yeah,
19, you know.
yeah. It's regional, definitely.
Well, yeah, and
Yeah.
what the clue that gives into the mind of the people,
Mhm.
that seems important.
Yeah. And also the, you know, fighting by air is new in that war. And so they weren't reporting weather over the radio. They were giving no weather reports because they didn't want to give information
Right, that's good.
about any of the weather. And so for this rural community, you know, the weather was what they survived on to some degree. So, and that I can't remember how I learned that, but that was from some of that very local research. And then just thinking about how much those things would have impacted the characters that I'm trying to, you know,
Do you base them on actual people, or is it just completely a construct?
it's based on the story that my dad told me about the soldiers interacting with the school children. He would have been very young, and I realized very quickly I couldn't tell it from a child as young as he would have been. He would have been like 7 or 8, and I made it the age of one of his older brothers, the main character. But it's really drawn from, I'm creating characters. The school teacher is a character. The soldiers, ironically, I've gotten some names of the soldiers. And some of the soldiers actually wrote stories of their time in the United States. So some of those things I'm drawing from those people, but even then, I wouldn't call them by the name that they really were, because I'm fictionalizing that fairly heavily. Yeah, but it kind of gives me more freedom to really make them fictional instead of trying to tie it to them. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm a huge history nerd. Did you get a chance to talk to any of the German soldiers, or any of them still around?
I didn't, I haven't, I mean, I'm still working on it, so, but some of them do still live in the US. I don't know if they're specifically from that camp, but there were, I think at one time, 1 million POWs in the US. There's a large number. And every state except Vermont had POWs. Although the ones in the Midwest, because they needed farm help, because people were overseas, the men were all overseas, or many of them. And because they just couldn't get very far if they did escape, if they were in the West. I think that's where they were sent, most of them were. But they were, yeah, so I'm sure, I am hoping to find that, or to just read more of the memoirs that they have written. Yeah, it's a really interesting history. Yeah. So,
It's obvious you're asking the ultimate fiction writer question, which is what was going on in their minds.
yeah,
Yeah,
well, I think it's why those pictures in the camps, just like, they were so unexpected, and I just got this sense of, something like a community. I know that there were tensions within the camps themselves, because some of them, of course, had been forced to be in the German military, and some of them really believed in you know, the awful regime they were fighting for. So there were tensions and actual, fights that broke out among the soldiers themselves. Because they were all being forced to live in these, even though they were treated by the, you know, the Accord or the Geneva Convention, they were in small, like, places, so, you know, it's not surprising that they had fights, and Radio Lab did a really good episode on this, and they actually found a soldier or a prisoner, and the daughter of a prisoner who talked about this as well. So, and occasionally when I've talked about this project, someone will say that their father, you know, was maybe involved somehow, like either as a camp guard, at one of these camps, and so there are people who still remember this and who are still there. Yeah.
So it was a camp where your father was around, was that something previously, because that's where State Park, you know, CCC camps were
Right.
converted over into their prison work.
Right. There were CCC camps in Illinois, but so the main camp in Illinois was Camp Ellis. And that was a camp, it was very big, and they just created it for the POW time. And so they would go there and then they'd be sent out to these small satellite camps in the farming communities, and Libby's was a big employer at that time. So they were sending them out to these small camps. So they did build temporary camps. The only thing that's left in Washington is one of the lookout towers that the guards used over the camps.
Hmm.
That structure is still there, but they weren't the CCC camps. They have them very close to the canning factories that were in the small towns.
Right.
So there was one in my dad's town, and then one in a small town called Eureka, Illinois. And they lived in colleges sometimes, because there were fewer college students at that time, so sometimes they actually, instead of barracks, they lived in the colleges. And yeah, so I think that depended on where they were. I know in some of the farming communities in the Midwest, they really didn't have barracks, and they actually lived with the farmers. So the farmers would have maybe 3 or 4 prisoners, and they would live with them.
It's kind of interesting today, when I read 7 years into that, they were German climbers that got caught in India after World War I broke out, and they put them in camps, and they would escape, and they'd bring them back, and the guards would just laugh about, oh yeah, you escaped, you know. It's kind of like the same there. It's just a lot of trust.
Right.
Prisoners themselves, and if they can escape, and it's other people we've been.
Yeah.
Yeah, jump out and go back in Germany.
Yeah. Well, also, I think, and this, I think, listening to a few of the accounts that I was listening to and reading, they weren't sure what they had to go back to.
Mm.
So, especially if they hadn't, you know, wanted to be part of the military anyway, you know, they weren't sure what they would go home to. So I don't think they were escaping as much as we might think they would. Yeah.
And one of my big questions was for lecture camp or any of these camps, how many just stayed and never went back? So,
Yeah. Some of them escaped with the intention of staying, not going back. Some of them, I mean, from what I've researched, some of them did not want to go, but they had to go back. And then others, of course, wanted to go.
We have an erstwhile Mennonite writer, which we don't often have. So I want to ask some questions about that. Can we start with Mennonite College?
Uh-huh.
I mean, you can talk about Mennonite education, but like, what was Mennonite College like?
There are actually, I think about 6 in the US. And in some ways it's probably similar to many religious private small colleges. But the Mennonite colleges have a history of becoming, during wartime, they're pacifist, and in Kansas, they were actually shut down. They were protesting during the Vietnam War. One of the Mennonite colleges flew the flag of Viet Cong, and so they were, they weren't disciplined, but that was actually a really interesting story. It's a long story, though, so I probably won't tell it, but they, and Mennonites don't traditionally hang the flag. So they also wouldn't hang the flag, and during wartime, that can also be an offense. But to answer your question, it's, it was a liberal arts college with Mennonite history courses, and the college I went to, because it was in Kansas, was a little more conservative than Goshen College in Indiana. It's the most liberal one. There's Eastern Mennonite University in Virginia, which is religiously a little more conservative, because the Eastern Mennonites are more conservative than the Midwestern Mennonites. But it's interestingly, they do a lot of social justice programs, just because of the history of pacifism, and they do anti-violence work. Yeah, I don't know if that really answers. your
Yeah,
question.
no, that's sort of, yeah.
Yeah,
Is there anything you miss about being in the community? Or what are the things you miss, I guess?
well, the sense of community was something that was so intense growing up that I didn't really realize until I left. And I didn't get baptized. My dad, I didn't get baptized. I chose not to until a few months before he died. So I left very intentionally, knowing that it wasn't the life for me. But I think the things that I missed were sort of the way they did social justice was so ingrained. It wasn't about them, it was about this larger belief. And that really influenced me very deeply. And just the commitment to doing that kind of work, no matter what your profession was. Those kinds of things really, I think, stayed with me and impressed me, and just living very true to your beliefs. They did live simply. My parents lived very simply, not looking to make money. And those values, I think, to have that within an entire community, I think is rare. And so I think those are the things, just the sincerity and really wanting to help people. My dad did prison ministry. He did gun buyback programs. Just all on his own, that wasn't required of his position, but he saw it as part of his life as an enemy. And the sanctuary movement.
Yeah, did not know at all about that.
Yeah. We had, in Indiana, we had a lot of, there were Vietnamese, people coming, but then we had Central Americans coming who were illegal, and they would just sort of drive through in a van, and they had to move very quickly through the United States. And then in Kansas, they would stay for a few months.
Yeah, this is all, I mean, obviously in the context right now, this is all.
With immigration, yeah, there's a lot of the policies that they had. Certainly, were precursors to some of what we have now. This is, yeah, this was in response to Reagan. There were some asylum issues that were going on at that time. And then there was one, and I don't know the legality, but there was one major asylum thing that passed that made it a little bit easier for people to get asylum in the early nineties. So that's why the sanctuary movement.
Yeah, 1990. Oddly, Reagan
Yeah,
now seems rather liberal in immigration compared to what's going on now.
yeah,
Yeah, he actually, there were a couple of acts, I used to teach immigration history. There were a couple of acts under Reagan and right after that liberalized immigration, basically for skilled workers,
Yeah.
mostly for skilled workers.
yeah.
Now, Mennonite itself is a pretty conservative faith, right? Just like,
The Mennonites I was raised by were, the faith, they're very, true to the text.
yeah,
I mean, that's the,
Yeah.
and so the pacifism and the social justice comes from New Testament. And it's, which is also why, in terms of the activism, it's not about them. Like, it's very much about living the life of Jesus for them. And they're deeply religious. Within the Mennonite church, some are more conservative in how they express that faith than others.
it's a fascinating dichotomy that something so conservative in your faith. And I think it's just the political culture of today,
Yeah,
where someone so conservative in faith can have such an interesting view of like immigration. you know,
Yeah.
Things like that.
well, both of my parents would have been quite conservative growing up. They were both from farms.
Mhm.
And then my dad, I think going to seminary really changed he became much more liberal after going to seminary. And he was at Harvard for a year during the civil rights movement when Black Power was coming in and they were burning down buildings on Harvard's campus. And that really changed him also. And so there was a big shift in the Mennonite church of more socially active Mennonites that came after the 60s.
That is surprising. I mean, I don't know what everybody's experience is around here, but we have a lot of Amish.
Yeah,
And it feels like they're very separate in many ways. I mean, that's a mistaken impression.
Yeah.
they
no,
they
But
don't,
it
they
feels like
traditionally don't vote. Yeah,
it feels like they live really separately. So to hear the activist part of this experience is surprising to me. I don't know if it's-
yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah, and my dad's church and the people I was with the most are liberal even by Mennonite standards. I mean, that's not necessarily reflective of the larger Mennonite culture. And yet it is enough of the culture that if you know about Mennonites, it's also not surprising. And I think the pacifism really is what that's rooted in, and the social justice. They've done some fairly amazing work. I mean, and they continue to do that, and they live in very conservative states. So they're of the sort of activist groups that are very, left now, especially they are called very left, who register as Republicans so they can, affect in the primaries, get the lesser evils on there, or I shouldn't say evils, but the ones who are the less extreme. Yeah, and then they'll vote Democrat, and there are a lot of activists who do that in the Midwest.
So I used to drive the Amish bus with
Yeah.
kids and stuff. Once they turn 15, 14, 15, there's no Amish college.
Yeah.
And they're out.
Yeah.
So kind of fascinated by it, and then college, they kind of go on, but George said, so what do they offer at Mennonite College?
And Mennonite college, the
So it's
Mennonites
seminary.
do educate in their own, like I went to a regular high school. So it's very much like a liberal arts. I went to a liberal arts college. And Mennonite college. But the Amish do not educate after 8th grade. And the Mennonites at one point did not either. And so when my dad wanted to go to college, his parents were very opposed to it. And so, but the history of Mennonite colleges does go back to the late 1800s. So, but it's always been uncomfortable until about the 40s or the 50s. And my grandfather, even though he was Swiss Mennonite, he was not Amish. My grandmother was Amish on my mother's side. He, I think, did not go to high school. But that also is just sort of the rural thing as well. They're very rural. But the Amish, when my dad's family immigrated in the early 1800s, they were Amish and then they became Mennonite. And so the people who were Amish in that community would have remained still not educated over 8th grade. And the Amish do not go to college. Yeah.
All skill based.
Yeah. I went on an Amish heritage tour in 2016 in Germany and Switzerland. And it started in England because there were 18 Amish, actively Amish people on it. And so they came on the boat, they didn't fly. And so we started in England. And so I was living with them, you know, on buses, and we were going to the historic sites. Because the Anabaptist origin is the same until, and that was in the 1526, right around the Reformation. And then about 50 years after that was when the split between, and they were Anabaptists, and then they all became Mennonites, who became Mennonite. And then after that was the split between the Amish, who wanted to remain more conservative than the Mennonites. And at that time, it was already an issue of education. They wanted to remain uneducated, or they only needed enough to read the Bible.
So I'm adapted, but I found my birth mother, whose last name is Sears, so we're probably 15 cousins.
Probably.
Her father married she was called a Gentile outside of the faith. So he actually got shunned by the Mennonite community. He's still in touch with his mother and father, so some of his brothers and sisters.
Yeah.
Didn't do that. So did you experience it?
No, so shunning is specific to Amish. The Mennonites don't shun, and that's another one of the dividing things, and it's, you know, it's intense, like it's a, they will, like there could be a family where the husband has been shunned, and he would stand outside if the whole family is, you know, in a family gathering, and family gatherings are a very big event in those communities. But since my family was Mennonite, and because I didn't join the church, I was not shunned. Yeah, but it wouldn't have been shunned anyway, like they
Whatever
accepted my choices. And part of the reason they accepted it is because they believe that it should be a choice that you get baptized. So if you make that choice, they respected it. And my dad, when I was in college, he asked me at one point, and I mean, this is what he gave his life to. He asked me if I would get baptized just to honor my heritage. And I said to him, I just don't think that Christianity is the only right thing and everything else is wrong. So there's really deep belief systems or no belief. And he looked at me and he said, I really respect your answer. And I would never ask you, and he never did. So it's that kind of acceptance that I think that's pretty consistent. And when I was traveling with the Amish, there was one older couple, not couple, but they had kids who were in their 20s who hadn't joined the Amish church. And it was beyond the Rumsford, like 1 year thing. They had been out for years, but they still lived at home with their parents, even though they weren't Amish. And her father had left the church and become a truck driver. And he still came home and parked his truck. So there is some acceptance of when people leave. They don't want to force people. But even within the Amish church, there are some very conservative, and I mean, it's a range of open and very conservative. So those things I'm saying, like, I'm sure there were, yeah.
I was surprised that shunning could actually be a doctrine or not a doctrine. It was just something that happened, like, you know.
Yeah,
that's actually-
education and church buildings and shunning are parts of this, why people sometimes eventually. Or sometimes it goes the other way, they'll go from being Mennonite if they're historically Amish to going back because they want to be more conservative. That happens as well. And there are also conservative Mennonite, which is confusing because they also dress like the Amish. And they're conservative Mennonite, but not technically Amish. And in Pennsylvania, it's everything is there.
Yeah, I think we have conservative Mennonites here, a couple of valleys over in Hammondsport
Right.
Yeah.
that dress, you know, the women are dressed in
Yeah,
what essentially looks like 19th century.
Yeah.
Century garment. Yeah, and they're Mennonite, not Amish.
yeah, and it's, you know, traveling with that Amish group, even though it's my history, and I've been in Amish communities and gone to Amish auctions and, you know, like, to actually live and eat with them every day. And then they had, they're really into reunions, so they were having these trip reunions in their homes, and it was really valuable. And they wanted us to see their schools, some of them were school teachers, and just to see how much fun they actually had and loved being with each other, and because they seemed so serious. And
She jumped out of the bus.
Yeah.
There's a lot of fun.
And like, it was really an experience that was valuable in addition to the history. But there's a point where you really feel the fact that they aren't educated past the 8th grade. And that, there were a couple of times where that just hit me. And you don't realize what you get, even if you think your high school isn't very good. Like, they really didn't have critical thinking. And you don't even realize what that is, like, but I realized how sarcastic I can be because they took everything I said,
Very,
like, and it was just eerie, you know. I had to be really careful because I would say something sarcastically and say, really? No.
So I have to ask this, since, you know, as an Italian, you married an Italian, this sense of community and family, was that like instantly recognizable both ways, or no?
My family is very unusual. from
Ah,
that
okay.
perspective.
Okay,
So no, I felt like you know, Jennifer's family is far more together and, you know, and family than
We
mine.
do have big reunions, yeah, we have reunions fairly regularly still. Yeah.
Also, you know, both of my parents passed away some time ago, and they were the center really of the family, and at this point, it's only my brothers and my sister, and they're just, you know, all over the place, yeah.
that you speak, Amish or German. So you,
I don't.
okay,
You know, and at the Mennonite college I went to, there was a big German studies program, and they would go to Germany, and I kind of wish I had been more into the history then. I wasn't. But that is, at the Mennonite colleges, they always have Mennonite history in German, and as you would expect.
I was just wondering, from the same time.
Yeah, I regret it. I regret it.
Bounce back and forth with that.
Yeah. And the German that the Amish speak is quite different than contemporary. Yeah, but you know, it's interesting, I did hear it enough growing up, especially in my mom's family. that it seems oddly familiar when I hear it, and sometimes in Mennonite churches, they do sing German hymns, even if you're just reading it phonetically. So the language to me is very beautiful. I know German is not beautiful to but it does have sort of that history.
Mozart managed to write opera in German. So
Right.
it can't be that bad.
Thank you. I'm gonna ask if anyone wants to read, but I don't think do we need a break? Yeah, we don't need a
Well,
break.
if you want to break, real quick, Abby's back here.
Oh,
If you want to
If anybody
refresh
take
their
a few minute
coffee.
break. Is anybody gonna read something?
I can do
Share
that too,
something.
from what I was doing. I'll just leave it from what I've done.
And you just got here, you might want, I mean, it's your bag, the lighting.
We'll take 5 and then we'll come back and hear it.
Right there.
Yes.